In this module, we're going to look at Wise's internal dynamic dialogue system, which is really quite sophisticated. Now, before we start, let's create a new work unit for our dialogue. And now we can start by importing some sound files into this work unit. Let's use the single sentence triggers that you'll have in your course material, and we'll just bring in those 3 collision files. Now, at this point, we do not want to be importing them as sound effects. We actually want to be importing them as sound voices. There are some different things that you can do with sound voices that you cannot do with sound effects, and we're going to look at that later in more detail. But just remember that when you're working with dialogue, if you want to be using any of Wise's dynamic dialogue systems, you need to be importing these sound assets as sound voices. So we'll go ahead and import those. And now we have here...
Oh, that's gonna leave a mark. Oh, that's gonna need a paint job.
3 variations on something that an announcer might say if there is a minor collision in a racetrack race. So let's pop those all into a random container. You can use all of the same containers that you normally have had access to in the actor mixer hierarchy, even if you're working with sound voices. Now we could go over to events, and you'll notice that there is a dynamic dialogue section in events. However, if we just want to trigger one of these every time a collision happens, then we actually don't need to use the dynamic dialogue system. For that, we simply can create a new work unit in the regular event section and place the event there, as we have done so far with other types of events. I bring this up primarily because I want you to understand that when working with dialogue, you have access to all of the normal tools we've looked at so far, and then additionally, you will have access to the dynamic dialogue structures, which we'll look at now. So to start, let's go into the dynamic dialogue's default work unit and just create a dialogue event. Now, if you click on this, you'll notice that there is nothing showing up in the folder property editor. And the reason for this is because you actually want to switch to a different layout when you're working with dialogue to have access to the tools available there. So try hitting F11, or you can go to Layouts and select Dynamic Dialogue. And this is where you start structuring the logic paths of the dialogue in question. So for example, let's start by bringing in some new audio into our dialogue work unit. And this time we'll select Game Switch for Sentence and bring in these 3 finish line assets. You'll see now that it's defaulting to sound voice because of our last selection. And now, unlike collision, these are not variations of one another. One of these is for if the player finishes in the last place, one is if they finish somewhere in the middle of the pack, and one is if they finish in the front, if they have won the race. And we will want the game to trigger only the sound voice that's relevant to the actual finish line status. So in order to do that, we're going to go over to our game syncs once again, and we are in fact going to be using states again. So let's create a new work unit for dialogue, and now we'll create a finish line state with 3 states inside: win, lose, and middle. Now going back over to our dialogue event, let's call it finish line. And now you're going to want to select your state group from this arrow here. You'll notice we can also use switches, but in this case we'll use state groups so that there can be a state for the player's status that is constantly changing according to where in the pack they are, and whatever the final state is when they have crossed the finish line, that will be the state that triggers our sound. This would be for a single player game where only the status of the player is important. Therefore, we can use a single global state. So now we'll select our lose state and click Add Path, and you'll notice that it populates a new path here based on the status lose. We can do the same thing with middle and with win. We don't need to worry ourselves with none because one of these states will always be valid. So let's go back over to our audio, and we can click and drag our relevant sound voices over to populate the appropriate path. Now, when this audio event finish line is triggered by the game, it will look at these possible state paths and then trigger the sound voice that is attached to it. Now, I did say that we didn't have to concern ourselves with none, but the truth is that occasionally the programming will be such that Wise never receives a state and will have to work with the information it has at hand. In that case, we could either use none or we could use add generic path. So this basically means if none of these states are present, then we'll just go with default, and in our case, we can put neutral here because it is appropriate with the widest range of possible events. Now there's one last thing that we're going to want to do to make sure that this is set up correctly, and that's going back to our game states. And let's take another look at our state over here. And we're going to have to hit F5 or change our layout back to designer to have access to the settings of that state. And now you'll see that our default transition time is 1 second. Now we want to bring that down to 0 because if we're tracking live the state of where the player is within the pack of race cars, then we want that to be instantaneous. We want that state to change even if the race car has just pulled out ahead of the pack a fraction of a second before it's passing the finish line. So let's just change our default transition time to 0. Now those state changes will be instantaneous, and that way we'll make sure we're always triggering the correct sound. Now, as you may have guessed, the dialogue system gets a lot deeper than we've just looked at here, and we're going to take a look at some deeper levels of the dialogue system in the next clip.